I've always been good at leaving, not out of cruelty or carelessness, but because I learned early on that some things only hurt when you stay too long. And I had already hurt enough. So I became an expert in quiet exits, a faint smile at the end of the night, a well-rehearsed excuse, a strategic absence the next day. People thought it was detachment, autonomy, that modern independence everyone admires. But it wasn't. It was fear. It was protection. It was a kind of armor that disguised itself well as strength, but inside, it trembled at every kinder gesture, every show of care that reminded me that yes, I could grow attached, and that sooner or later would mean losing. So I distanced myself from anything that seemed too good. When the world offers something too sweet, you learn to spit it out before swallowing, wary of poison hidden in the sweetness. Not that I hadn't tried. I'd been in relationships, heard I love you, thought for fleeting moments that maybe this time would be different. But the problem with someone who's always bracing for abandonment is that every silence becomes a sign, every delay a verdict, every misstep a trigger to flee. I didn't know how to stay. I only knew how to run, before it hurt. And that's exactly what I did. I kept myself busy, productive, surrounded by commitments, shallow encounters, loose ties. And for a while, it worked. Until he showed up. Not with promises or urgency, but with a calm that unnerved me. He didn't say, "I'll stay." He just stayed. He didn't try to invade or decipher me. He was just there, day after day, looking at me as if he knew there was more behind the wall. But he wouldn't tear it down by force. And that's what threw me off. He didn't play games, didn't create scarcity, didn't exploit my fear to trap me. On the contrary, it was the freedom he gave me that kept me coming back. But coming back, for someone like me, was dangerous. Because every step closer was also a fall, and I was terrified of falling. So I started pulling away. At first subtly, spacing out messages, postponing plans. Then more directly, ignoring invitations, closing doors gently like someone who doesn't want to make noise, but is leaving again. I thought he'd react like the others, that he'd demand answers, get frustrated, disappear. But he didn't. He just remained. He didn't push, but he didn't vanish either. It was that patience, that silent way of staying, that made me question my escape, because for the first time, someone didn't chase me, nor let me go. He just waited with a presence that spoke louder than any words. As much as I wanted to stay in control, he began creeping into my thoughts at the most unexpected moments, in the middle of a meeting when I opened the fridge, or simply while crossing the street and seeing a gesture that reminded me of him. And it wasn't his absence that made me think of him, but his constant presence, even when he wasn't there. That irritated me, because I had built a life where no one was indispensable, where the slightest hint of attachment was a sign of weakness. But he disarmed me without effort. While others tried to win me over with promises or urgency, he just showed up whole, as he was. I, used to fleeing anything that demanded surrender, now found myself trying to convince myself that this feeling was just a distraction. But deep down, I already knew it wasn't. I started making excuses. I told myself he was too good to be true, that he'd eventually show his true colors, that it was all a facade, and of course, any small slip, a shorter reply, a quieter day, became proof in my mind. I twisted facts to fit my narrative that it was better to leave, because if I let myself believe, if I let myself feel, I might not be able to walk away. And love, for someone who's always had to run, is like a minefield. You walk in fear, expecting the explosion. But at the same time, there's something that draws you in. A desire to stay, even without knowing how. And it was in that conflict that I began to lose myself, between the urge to retreat and the longing to give in. He, on the other hand, remained himself. Steady, serene, present. He didn't demand, but he showed. He didn't pressure, but he stayed. That confused me, because I had learned to spot those who wanted to trap me, the ones who made promises, who dramatized, who demanded reciprocity like currency. But he did none of that. He just stayed, and that forced me to look at myself with more honesty than I was ready for. I began to realize that it wasn't him who scared me. It was what he awakened in me, the possibility of not needing to run, and that, for someone who had spent a lifetime running, was as new as it was terrifying. Deep down, I wanted him to give up. I wanted him to leave, so I could confirm once again that the world was exactly as I always thought, that no one stays. But instead he remained. And it was in that steady silence that he began to unravel me. I tried to stick to my script, the one that said, after a certain point, I'd disappear, withdraw, become a memory for the other and relief for me. And outwardly, I did just that. I left messages unanswered, invented commitments, pulled away with grace. I pretended life was full, time was short, priorities had shifted, all rehearsed, all the same as before, except inside, something hurt differently because he didn't leave. And worse, or better, I still don't know. He didn't chase me either. He didn't bang on my door, didn't make a scene, didn't send long messages demanding explanations. He simply stayed, as if saying with that calm way of his that he knew I needed space, but that wouldn't make him vanish, and that's what started to break me. The absence of demands, the gentleness of his waiting, the security of not needing to prove anything. I expected a reaction, anything to confirm I was in control. But he, with that silent gaze, made me feel something else. That maybe I had never been in control of anything, that maybe everything I'd done until then was just survival. And now, faced with something real, I didn't know what to do. I told myself he didn't understand, that he had no idea of the chaos it was to let someone in. But deep down, I knew he understood. He just wasn't willing to feed the cycle. He offered me something else. A kind of love that didn't invade, didn't demand, but stayed there, like a light at the end of a dark hallway in case I decided to return. And I thought about returning many times, but pride, fear, shame, they tangled into a knot that kept me stuck. I wondered what he'd think if I reappeared, if he'd still accept me, if he'd still be willing. And more than that, I wondered if I could, this time, not run. Because loving truly demands something I was never sure I had: surrender, courage, presence. And I didn't know if I was ready, but something inside me, maybe the part that always wanted to be seen, began whispering that it might be time to try. For the first time, I wanted to stay, and that in itself was a revolution. I came back slowly, first with a short, almost casual message, like someone just checking in, though every letter typed was heavy with expectation. I waited for his reply like waiting for a verdict. I didn't know if he'd still be there. I didn't know if he'd still choose me. The response came without drama, without loose ends, simple, direct, kind. He was fine. And in a few words, he made a point to say he was happy to hear from me. That unraveled me more than any romantic speech, because I understood in that moment that he didn't want to punish me, judge me, or make me pay for pulling back. He just wanted to meet me where I was, and maybe this time I was a little closer. In the days that followed, I approached cautiously, like someone stepping onto a frozen lake, testing if the surface would hold. I sent messages in the middle of the night when fear felt smaller. I shared songs, silly stories, pieces of myself I'd always hidden, and he, as always, received me with patience, without rushing, without pulling, just present. I began to realize that what I felt with him was different from anything I'd ever known. It wasn't euphoria or a high tide. It was stability. It was a kind of peace that scares you, especially if you grew up in chaos. It was the good silence of being with someone who doesn't expect you to pretend. With him, I didn't need to be charming or strong all the time. I could just be. But with that closeness came fear too, because the more I wanted to stay, the more I feared ruining it. I started noticing how much I sabotage myself, the way I go silent when I most need to speak, how I avoid talking about feelings as if that would make me a hostage. And more than ever, I understood that the problem wasn't him. It never was. It was my reflection, my layers, my internal escapes, and facing that hurt. One day while we talked, he said something that broke me inside. He said he didn't know how long he could keep waiting, but he didn't want to pressure me either. That he wanted me whole, not in pieces, not as a guest. And that was a mirror. I saw myself clearly there. This woman living between the desire to love and the fear of being loved. That's when I realized hiding behind pretty excuses wouldn't work anymore. Either I faced what I felt, or I'd lose the only person who saw beyond my masks. And more than fear of losing him, I felt fear of losing myself. Because with him, I caught glimpses of the person I could be if I stopped running. A Lorelei less tense, less defensive, lighter. And if there was any chance of becoming that version of myself, the one who doesn't run, who stays, then maybe it was time to try, not for him, but for me. I began rebuilding myself from the inside with the care of someone holding something old and cracked, trying to glue each piece without losing its original shape. There wasn't a single moment when I declared to myself, now I'll change. It was a process, a daily rehearsal between the impulse to run and the desire to stay. And in that process, I forced myself to look more honestly at the scared little girl inside me. The one who learned that love always came with absence, that too much presence was a threat, that every closeness meant a future goodbye. I had to sit with her, listen to her, not silence her anymore, because she was the one making me run. She was the one who, even when everything was fine, whispered that it was better not to get attached. In our meetings, I started being fully there, not just physically, but emotionally. I learned to look into his eyes, to listen without filtering only what suited me, to speak when my heart wanted to hide. And he noticed. He didn't say it with words, but there was a different spark in his gaze, like someone who knows, at last, that someone has returned from an internal war. We started seeing each other more often, but without haste. Sometimes we just sat side by side in silence, and that was more intimate than any declaration. That's how he loved me, in the small spaces, the everyday gestures without asking for more than I could give, but celebrating every step I chose to take for myself. Still, there was a decisive moment. A tough conversation where he told me he couldn't keep walking for both of us. That he'd stay, yes, but he needed to feel reciprocity, that my movement was real and not just another cycle of approach and retreat. That hurt, but not as a threat, as a truth I needed to hear. For the first time, someone set a boundary with love, and that didn't make me want to run. It made me want to deserve it. And I knew, deep down, that I was ready to do things differently, because at my core, I never wanted abandonment. I only feared it was inevitable. But now, standing before him, I saw that abandonment would only come if I chose to repeat the same pattern. And this time, I wouldn't. I started showing it with actions. I was present, not out of obligation, but by choice. I sent messages not just when I felt safe, but when I felt vulnerable. I asked how he was without fear of seeming needy. I held his hand longer. I listened to his stories without looking for flaws. And little by little, the relationship stopped being a dance where he moved and I stepped back. It became a step together. There were still stumbles, of course. Sometimes I went silent out of reflex. Sometimes I felt the urge to create distance. But the difference was that now I noticed, took a deep breath, and stayed. And in that space, where there had only been escape, something new began to grow. Trust, not just in him, in myself. The change didn't come with fanfare. It came as a series of small gestures that, together, started rewriting what once seemed unchangeable. I realized one night, as we walked side by side in silence, that I no longer wanted to run. The fear was still there, yes, but it no longer dictated my steps. Now I knew it was possible to keep going even while trembling inside. And it was strange to realize that, almost like seeing myself for the first time, without the defenses that always defined me. Part of me still resisted, tried to sabotage the moment with old thoughts, but another part, stronger and newer, responded with something new, the desire to stay. With him, I began allowing myself spaces of truth. I shared memories I'd never shared before. Fragments of my story I always thought would scare any sensible person away. I spoke of nights when I felt completely disconnected from the world, of wounds I carried in silence, of losses that taught me love was synonymous with absence. And he just stayed there, not trying to fix, not offering ready solutions, but listening with a kind of attention that can't be taught, only felt. His eyes said more than any rehearsed response. They said, "I see you," and being seen truly was an experience that still threw me off. That surrender, that vulnerability wasn't just mine. Over time, I began to see his silences too. The way he avoided talking about certain disappointments, how he hid old pains behind a calm smile. I started realizing that his strength didn't come from an absence of wounds, but from how he chose to keep going despite them. And that touched me deeply. Seeing the man who always seemed so steady also falter, also hesitate, made me respect him even more. Because he didn't pretend to be invincible. He just chose to love even when it hurt. I started showing more, not with grand gestures, but with presence. With unexpected phone calls just to hear his voice. With simple messages saying, "I thought of you." With the choice to show up even on days when instinct told me to vanish. And he reciprocated with the same care as always. Not with euphoria, but with consistency. I learned, with him, that true love doesn't explode. It sustains. And in that new rhythm, unhurried and undemanding, I began recognizing lighter versions of myself. Versions that didn't always look for the exit. Versions that were, at last, starting to put down roots. It was only when I found myself breathing, deeply at peace beside him, that I realized how my entire life had been driven by tension. Not the obvious tension of conflicts or urgencies, but an internal, constant tension, as if I were always on the edge of an invisible disaster. I used to confuse peace with boredom, affection with threat, presence with confinement. But with him, I learned that love can be silent and still full of meaning. That being with someone doesn't mean losing yourself, but finding space to be whole. That's when I started noticing how my old choices always revolved around fear. Fear of giving too much, fear of depending, fear of loving and being leaked. But he didn't leave me. Not when I took too long to reply. Not when I still froze at simple feelings. He didn't expect perfection, just truth. And curiously, that made me want to be better. Not to please him, but because with him I felt I could. That it was possible to build something without leaving pieces of myself behind. And even in moments when I hesitated again, because yes, they still came, a single look from him, a gesture of care, was enough to remind me, now it's different. Now I can choose to stay, and choosing to stay, in my case, was a revolutionary act. I was never taught to trust love. On the contrary, I grew up believing it came with an expiration date, that sooner or later it disappointed. But with him, I began to see that true love doesn't ask for guarantees. It's built in the present, in the now, in the gesture of someone who wakes up and, once again, chooses to be there. With him, I learned to walk without running, to breathe before reacting, to understand that loving isn't losing yourself in the other, but allowing yourself to be seen, even on days when you're not a light. And that's exactly what he did. He saw me, even in my silences. He saw me when I tried not to see myself. And with that, without making a sound, he taught me what it is to be a home, a place where I didn't need to arrive running or leave in a hurry, a place where, for the first time, I could stop. And it was in stopping that I realized I was already exactly where I wanted to be. The days began to take on a different rhythm after that. It was as if I had finally turned off the internal alarm that kept me constantly on edge. Not because everything was suddenly resolved, but because I now knew I could breathe within the relationship. I no longer needed to brace for abandonment or prepare for the end before the story even began. I was there, present, and for the first time, whole. It was strange to live the feeling that I didn't need to run anymore, that no one was trying to trap me, that there wasn't a hidden catch under the affection as my mind had so often made me believe. It was just love, simple, sincere, calm, and I was learning to receive it. With him, I began to experience new things, small things, but huge for me, like sleeping peacefully beside someone, without fear that the affection of that night would turn into distance the next day, like talking about the future without feeling caged, like accepting an invitation for a weekend without planning an excuse to leave early. He didn't make grandiose promises or demand formal commitments, but every day, in some way, he reaffirmed his presence. And that, for someone who grew up in absence, was everything. Of course, not everything was easy. There were still days when the old version of me wanted to take control. That inner voice saying, be careful, don't trust too much, don't give too much. But now, I had a choice. And every time I chose to stay, even scared, I felt a piece of me healing. It was on an ordinary afternoon, one of those seemingly unimportant ones, that I realized he too carried pains he didn't voice. We were together in silence when I noticed his distant gaze. I asked calmly, without pressure, and he told me about an old loss, a disappointment that marked him, and in that moment I understood. He stayed too because he almost ran once. That revelation created something new between us, a space where fragilities could breathe, where neither of us needed to pretend strength all the time. And that's when I realized that for love to triumph, you don't need to eliminate fear. You need to learn to love it alongside, to embrace the part of us that still fears, still hesitates, but chooses to walk anyway. With him, I didn't conquer insecurity, but I learned I could hold his hand even while trembling, and that was enough. Because true love isn't about never falling. It's about choosing to get up together as many times as it takes. We didn't mark the moment it became love. There was no declaration with flowers or a solemn I love you with music in the background. It happened in silence, like the light creeping into a house at dawn. Suddenly it was there, present, alive, undeniable. And unlike anything I'd imagined, love didn't arrive as a noisy revolution. It came as a mutual understanding, a complicity that didn't need explaining. It was in the way he remembered, details of what I said, in how I started waiting for him without haste, but with certainty, in the way our silences fit together. I no longer needed assurance that he'd stay. I just knew he would. And more importantly, I knew I would too. What was once an internal struggle became a calm choice. Being with him didn't require effort but surrender. And surrender, for me, was always the challenge. I, who spent my life with one foot out the door, now found myself locking it from the inside. Not out of fear he'd leave, but out of a desire to nurture what we were building. There was a sweetness in being with him that didn't demand performance. I didn't need to prove anything or ask for anything. Being was enough. And he understood that like few others. Sometimes we just looked at each other, and that said more than long conversations. In his eyes was a kind of thank you for staying that moved me without a word. I started noticing changes in myself too. My friends said my gaze was different, my voice calmer, my demeanor lighter, and it was true. Being with him allowed me to access a part of myself that always existed, but I hid for fear it was too fragile. With him, being sensitive stopped being weakness. It became a bridge. And when I saw that he too was becoming more open, more talkative, more surrendered, I knew we were growing together. He showed me that staying wasn't just an act. It was a practice, a daily gesture. And I was finally ready to reciprocate. It was in a mundane conversation, one about everyday things, that I heard myself saying I wanted to see him next week, and then the next month, and maybe every month after. It wasn't a promise. It was just a realization, like looking at the sky and saying, it's going to rain. The certainty came quietly, and he, on the other side, just smiled and said, me too. In that moment, I understood there was nothing left to prove. That love, when it's real, doesn't need to be conquered. It just needs to be chosen. And we, at last, were choosing each other. Today, when I look back, I see all the versions of myself that ran before they could feel. The ones that gave up too soon. The ones that sabotaged themselves out of fear of being loved. And I don't feel anger toward them. I feel compassion. They were trying to protect me. But now that I've learned to stay, I see how courage isn't in resisting love, but in letting it in. And I let it in. He came in, not by storming, but by waiting. And when I stepped in too, I found a space made for two. A love that didn't come with demands, but with presence. A love that didn't try to change me, but let me change on my own. In my time, with my doubts, with my stumbles. He's still the same, calm, present, sincere. But today, I'm different beside him. Not the woman who rehearses exits, but the one who memorizes staying. The one who knows the value of a shared routine, a silence together, a hand offered when the day feels heavy. I learned that staying isn't stagnation. It's in fact a constant motion of care, choice, presence. And today, when he walks through the door and smiles, I no longer think of everything that could go wrong. I just take a deep breath and give thanks for him not leaving, and even more for me finally choosing to stop running. Love triumphed, not because it was perfect, but because it was patient, because it didn't shout when I fell silent, because it waited when I needed time, and above all, because it stayed, even when I doubted I deserved it. And now that I stay too, whole, with my feet firmly on the ground and my heart without bars, I understand that loving isn't losing yourself. It's, at last, finding yourself in the other, without ceasing to be who you are.